Okay, let's take a deep dive. We've got this stack of sources, news articles, some analysis, and our mission today really is to unpack what's happening with a pretty significant legislative debate. This was in the U.S. House recently.
That's right. We're looking specifically at proposed changes to the Medicaid program, and we're leaning heavily on the details, the estimates reported by the CBO, that's the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office.
All right. They looked at this bill that came out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee back in May 2025.
Exactly. So the goal is to sort of cut through the noise, understand the proposals, the potential impacts, according to the CBO.
Different sides argued it.
And just get a feel for the dynamics, what was actually at stake.
Okay, so let's set the scene. These Medicaid proposals, they were part of a larger Republican bill from the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Yeah, our sources frame it that way, part of a bigger push to enact President Trump's agenda, taxes, border, energy, and healthcare obviously fitting in there.
And the committee itself, they had a specific goal, a savings target.
They did. The reports we looked at said the committee was tasked with finding $880 billion in savings over a decade.
Yeah, okay. $880 billion total. And how much of that was supposed to come from these Medicaid changes?
Well, the CBO estimates cited in the sources suggested the main Medicaid policies could account for like $625 billion of that, a huge chunk.
$625 billion just from the Medicaid side. That's massive. So how were they planning to get there? What were the specific policies mentioned?
Okay, so several key things stood out in the sources. The biggest piece, savings-wise, seemed to be work requirements.
Work requirements. For whom?
The idea was states could impose them on childless adults, ages 19 to 64, who are on Medicaid. There were some exemptions mentioned, but that was the core.
And the CBO projection for just that part?
Almost $301 billion over 10 years. That was the single largest saving identified in the reports we saw.
Incredible. Okay, what else was in there?
Another major policy was about overturning specific rules from the Biden administration related to Medicaid.
Rolling back previous regulations.
Yeah.
Makes sense as a way to change direction. Any estimate on that?
Yeah, the CBO figured repealing those rules would save close to $163 billion.
Okay, still very significant.
Definitely. Then there was a proposed moratorium on something called provider taxes.
Provider taxes.
Yeah.
Right? I think I saw that mentioned this, where states tax hospitals or other providers and then use that money to kind of boost their federal Medicaid match.
Exactly. It's a financing mechanism. Stopping that practice, the CBO estimated, could save roughly $87 billion.
Got it. So work requirements, rolling back rules, stopping provider taxes.
Yeah.
Anything else major on the Medicaid front?
Well, the sources also mentioned penalizing states that pay for Medicaid for people who enter the U.S. without authorization.
Okay.
And also codifying some Trump administration proposals to shorten the open enrollment period for the Affordable Care Act, the ACA.
And it's worth remembering, like the sources pointed out, this energy and commerce bill wasn't only about healthcare, right?
Not at all. It also included things like repealing parts of the Democrats' 2022 climate bill, like a $20 billion green bank and a $3 billion pollution reduction grant program. So, yeah, this Medicaid stuff was happening within a much broader legislative package.
Right. Context is key. Okay, so let's pivot to the impacts. This is where it gets really heated, I imagine. What did the CBO estimates, as reported, say about how these Medicaid changes would affect people's coverage?
This was definitely a focus in the sources. The headline CBO finding that kept coming up was that an estimated 10.3 million people would lose their coverage under Medicaid.
10.3 million losing Medicaid. And do the CBO estimate what happens to them? Do they get other insurance?
Well, that's the other critical number cited. Of that 10.3 million, the CBO estimated that 7.6 million people would become uninsured altogether.
Wow. So not just shifting coverage, but potentially millions losing it entirely, according to those projections.
That's the takeaway from the CBO numbers highlighted in the reporting, yeah. And you can see why that became such a political flashpoint. It really framed the debate around potential human costs versus fiscal savings.
And the sources did mention these were partial estimates, it's worth noting.
Good point, yes. They were described as partial.
So with numbers like that floating around, the debate must have been fierce. How did the different sides frame their arguments based on what we read? Let's start with the Republican perspective.
Okay. As presented in the sources, the Republican argument centered on streamlining Medicaid, making it more sustainable. The committee chair, Brett Guthrie, was quoted.
What did he say?
He said the goal was to better focus the program on serving the most vulnerable beneficiaries. He specifically mentioned expectant mothers, children, people with disabilities, and the elderly.
And he also made a point about taxpayer money.
Yeah, so that quote appeared too about returning taxpayer dollars to middle-class families. Republicans also argued that any drop in coverage would mostly affect people who entered the U.S. without permission.
And, quote, able-bodied adults who should be working. That was the framing.
That was definitely part of the argument presented. And some, like Representative Dan Crenshaw, got quite pointed, accusing Democrats of basically misrepresenting the impact for political points.
Yeah, I saw a quote attributed to him saying something like, Democrats were using you and they're lying to you when talking to opponents.
Right. Pretty strong language reported there.
Okay, so that's one side. What about the Democrats? How did they argue against the bill, according to the sources?
Their core argument, as reported, was that these changes would be devastating for healthcare access. The ranking member, Frank Pallone Jr., was quoted directly.
It was his main line.
He said the bill would take away health care from millions of Americans. Straightforward.
And he connected it to something else, too, didn't he? Something about taxes.
Yes, that framing was really prominent in the coverage. Pallone linked the health care cuts directly to paying for, quote, giant tax breaks for billionaires and big corporations.
So a very different narrative there. What about the work requirements specifically? Did Democrats address those?
They did. They apparently pointed to previous CBO analyses suggesting work requirements often just cause people to lose coverage rather than actually helping them find jobs. Pallone was also quoted pushing back hard on any idea the bill was moderate.
He said, nothing could be further from the truth.
I believe. That's the quote that was reported, yeah.
Okay, so you really see the clash. One side, streamline, fiscal responsibility, focus on certain groups. The other side, devastating cuts, millions losing care, funding tax breaks for the rich.
And just to be clear, for everyone listening, we're presenting these arguments as they're reported in our sources. We're not endorsing either side, just laying out the debate as it was described.
Exactly. Understanding both perspectives is crucial.
And the process of debating this bill, the committee markup, it sounds like it was quite something. What did the sources say about how that actually went down?
Oh, yeah. Reports said the bill passed the committee on a party line vote, 30-24. But only after this, just marathon meeting. How long are we talking?
Over 26 hours straight.
26 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That sounds intense and probably pretty contentious.
Extremely. Sources described a lot of friction, members sniping at each other. That's where that Crenshaw quote, "If I could roll two eyes, I would," reportedly came from, aimed at Democratic arguments.
And weren't there actual protests inside the hearing room?
Yes, apparently protests broke out pretty early on. The reports mentioned 26 demonstrators being arrested. Many were in wheelchairs protesting the potential impacts. A group called Popular Democracy in Action took credit, according to the articles.
And the length itself, the 26 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Did the sources suggest that was partly strategic on the Democrats' side?
It seemed that way. Reports indicated they forced votes on numerous amendments, essentially using the time as a form of protest, drawing things out.
You can imagine the sheer exhaustion. Were there any sort of human details mentioned?
A few came through in the reporting,
Yeah.
like Representative Debbie Dingell apparently nodding off at one point, understandable, and Representative Richard Hudson was quoted listing his survival kit.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
Energy drinks, fruit, and nicotine pouches. He specifically mentioned drinking 4 Celsius and being on his 3rd can of Zyn.
Huh. That really paints a picture of these legislative trenches. And didn't the House Minority Leader show up?
He did. Hakeem Jeffries made a late appearance, which signals, high-level Democratic opposition to the whole thing.
So, intense partisan battle. But the sources also mentioned divisions within the Republican Party over this.
Absolutely. Medicaid was described as the biggest flashpoint internally for Republicans on this bill.
How so? What were the divisions?
Well, you had moderate Republicans, and maybe those in puffer districts politically, who are apparently quite wary of the fallout from major Medicaid cuts. They seem to have won some concessions.
Concessions? Like what?
The big ones mentioned were that the final committee bill did not lower the federal matching rate for Medicaid, the FMAP.
Okay, that's huge. That's the core federal funding percentage.
Exactly. And they also avoided imposing a per capita cap on spending, which would have been another fundamental shift, limiting federal funds per person instead of the open-ended match. Keeping those out was seen as a win for the moderates.
So they avoided some of the most drastic structural changes. But then you had the other side within the party, the fiscal hawks.
Right. People like Freedom Caucus Chair Andy Harris, Representative Chip Roy, they were quoted arguing the bill didn't actually cut enough, didn't do enough to stop waste, fraud, and abuse, as they termed it.
Harris even posted on social media about it, didn't he, saying the proposals wouldn't do much.
Yeah, something like they will do little to achieve that regarding stopping waste, fraud, and abuse.
And some conservatives were explicitly saying they needed more changes before a floor vote.
Yes. Representatives Eric Burleson and Ralph Norman were mentioned. They were reportedly unhappy, especially that the work requirements wouldn't start until 2029.
Pushed way out.
Right. Burleson was quoted saying, "In my opinion, they don't go far enough." And Norman talked about needing to get the math in order and make substantial changes. It shows that tension.
So Speaker Mike Johnson had a real needle to thread there, trying to satisfy the hardliners without losing the moderates, all with a very slim majority. And wasn't there even a warning from a senator?
Yeah, Senator Josh Hawley wrote an opinion piece around that time, cited in the sources, warning that steep cuts were, in his words, both morally wrong and politically suicidal.
It just highlights the really difficult political math the House leadership was facing, especially with a reported Memorial Day deadline looming for a floor vote.
A very tough spot.
Okay, so let's bring this back to you, the listener. Why should you care about this specific, maybe wonky-sounding legislative fight? What's the relevance?
Well, a few big reasons. First, obviously, the potential impact on healthcare for millions. We saw the CBO numbers, 10.3 million potentially losing Medicaid, 7.6 million becoming uninsured. That affects real people, vulnerable groups.
Absolutely. Even if you're not directly affected, that's a major societal shift.
Then there's the money. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars in government spending and proposed savings. This whole debate is really about fundamental ideas. What's the role of government safety nets? What's the balance between individual responsibility and social support? Fiscal management.
Right. These debates reflect deep philosophical differences.
And finally, just watching how this played out, the marathon session, the protests, the arguments, the internal party fights, the compromises, it gives you a real insight into how messy and complex making major laws actually is in Congress, especially when things are so divided.
It's like a case study in the legislative process itself.
Exactly. How policy actually gets made or sometimes doesn't get made under pressure.
So to quickly recap, we looked at sources describing this House bill aiming for huge Medicaid savings through things like work requirements and rule changes,
which sparked this massive debate. Republicans framing it as streamlining and responsibility, Democrats framing it as harmful cuts funding tax breaks.
The committee process itself was described as this incredibly long, contentious affair, reflecting not just partisan divides, but also splits within the Republican Party.
Yeah, and the core tension that comes through in all the sources is this really tough balancing act, trying to achieve significant budget savings versus the potential impact on healthcare for millions, with wildly different views on the purpose and the consequences.
So here's something to think about. Based on everything we've just unpacked from these sources. When you see a debate like this, with such starkly different views on needs versus budgets, what does it tell you about the fundamental challenge our society faces in trying to square fiscal goals with the very idea of a social safety net, especially when we're so politically divided?
It's definitely something to keep chewing on as these issues continue to come up.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
See you next time.